I was never the kind of person who believed in local legends. Archives, numbers, and dates always made more sense to me than any superstition. But everything changed when I started that temporary job in the Appalachians. It all began the day I found an unmarked box. Inside were disappearance reports no one was ever meant to see, all connected to a road officially closed since 1987. That same day, while I was still reading through those documents, the radio in my workspace turned on by itself, and what came through it was the exact same sound recorded in the victim's last transmissions. I didn't know it then, but the road everyone avoided was already reaching for me, even though I hadn't driven anywhere near it yet. I arrived in Hickory Pass on a gray October morning that felt heavier than the weather forecast suggested. The town sat folded into the lower ridges of the Appalachians, where the mist didn't simply hang in the air. It clung to the ground like it refused to rise. The building where I would be working, the Hickory Pass Municipal Archive, looked as though someone had taken an old post office, drained all the color from it, and forgotten to repaint it once sunlight returned. The windows were narrow rectangles, the frames rusted in a way that suggested decades of disuse, and the largest part of the structure was a cinder block addition at the back that leaned subtly toward the forest. I told myself the sensation pressing against my ribs was just caffeine withdrawal from the long drive the day before. But even then, before I had opened the door or met anyone from the Historical Society, there was something else, something layered beneath the expected fatigue, a sense that I had crossed into a place whose secrets were not buried but drifting just beneath the surface, waiting for any disturbance to rise again. Inside, dust swirled in a way that made it appear alive. The air smelled faintly of mildew, metal, and old paper, a combination I had encountered in other archives but never in a mixture quite like this. The shelves near the entrance leaned with the weight of decades, and on the far wall hung a corkboard with faded notices pinned so tightly together that no single piece of information could be separated from the next. The building hummed with the low, uneven buzz of fluorescent lights that flickered often enough to create the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. My temporary workspace was a small room near the back, positioned just beside the cinder block addition. A thin metal desk, a cracked linoleum floor, and, oddly, a radio mounted into the wall. It wasn't modern. Its brushed aluminum face was scratched, its tuning dial yellowed, and its small built-in speaker covered by a grill that had begun to warp. I assumed it had been installed sometime in the early 70s, meant for internal announcements back when the building served a different purpose. I didn't think much of it then, but later its presence would matter more than I could have imagined. I spent the first few hours sorting through boxes that had been clearly labeled for processing. Local census documents, school records, property deeds. Everything had a designation, a number, and a year. Everything belonged somewhere. And then just after noon, when I was searching for an empty cart to transfer a stack of fragile photo binders, I opened a cabinet beneath the desk. Inside was a box that did not match anything in the archive. It was gray, or it had once been gray, and time had given it a mottled, uneven texture, as though moisture had seeped into the cardboard and dried again. There were no labels, no year, no archival code. Only a faint rectangular area on the lid where adhesive residue suggested that a tag had once existed. Someone had removed it deliberately. Not recently. The cardboard beneath had yellowed evenly with the rest. At first, I thought it might be an empty container someone had forgotten to discard. But when I lifted it, the weight shifted inside, concentrated toward one corner, as though the contents had been packed carelessly. That was my second clue that something was wrong. No one in this building packed anything haphazardly. The entire archive operated on strict order. The absence of that order stood out. I placed the box on the desk and opened the lid slowly, careful not to tear the fragile cardboard. A draft of cold, stale air escaped, a detail that should not have meant anything, yet trails of dust rose in such a concentrated column that I paused without realizing it. Inside, stacked loosely and at odd angles, were several manila folders. Their edges were warped from humidity, and flecks of dirt clung to the corners as though they had once been stored somewhere exposed. The top folder had a single sheet of paper clipped to the front, a faded incident report from 1981. The typewriter font was uneven, suggesting the machine had been overdue for maintenance at the time of typing. The report contained the usual fields: date, location, name of individual, but what caught my attention was the location line. It listed a place I had never heard of despite reviewing the town's official records before accepting the job: Avery Ridge Road. I scanned the report, expecting something mundane such as a minor traffic incident. Instead, the final section, labeled Summary, described a disappearance. The last known contact was recorded as radio communication between the driver and someone identified only as dispatch. The details were sparse, but one sentence lingered in my mind long after I finished reading it. Final transmission contained audible interference not consistent with standard band noise. I brushed off the instinctive reaction that crept up my spine. Rural areas experience strange interference frequently. Mountains distort signals. Weather patterns cause anomalies. There was no reason to interpret it as unusual. But then I opened the second folder. Another disappearance, the same road, different year, 1983. Again, the final contact involved radio transmission affected by unidentified static patterns. Folder after folder followed the same structure: missing drivers, incomplete investigations, reports that ended abruptly with statements indicating insufficient evidence, all centered on Avery Ridge Road, a place I had never seen referenced in any official map, not even in the extensive survey documents the archive possessed for the entire county. I tried to rationalize it. Roads are renamed, towns reclassify areas, old routes become obsolete, absorbed into new ones. I told myself I would simply look up whatever designation it held now, but something about the absence of the road from all current documents, combined with the severity of the reports, created a tightness in my chest I couldn't quite explain. By the time I reached the final folder, my fingertips felt coated with a layer of cold dust, though the room itself remained warm enough to make my skin prickle. The last report was dated 1987. The same year the road, according to a brief handwritten note stapled inside, had been officially closed. There was no explanation for the closure, no engineering survey, no mention of landslides or erosion, no photographs of structural damage, just a stamped approval form from the county and a brief line noting the installation of barricades. My pulse quickened as I read the final page, a supplemental attachment that looked as though it had been added after the rest of the report. It contained a transcription of the last radio transmission ever received from someone on Avery Ridge Road. The wording was incomplete. Every few lines, the record contained brackets noting indecipherable noise. But the part that unnerved me most was the final notation. Transmission ceased abruptly. Audible unknown source preceding termination. Unknown source. Not interference, not static, not weather, unknown source. I closed the folder and stepped back, trying to ground myself. I reminded myself that even the most alarming archival material is still just paper, records of past events that may or may not have been accurately documented. But my breath felt shallow, and the light in the room seemed to dim slightly, though I knew that had to be the flickering of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. I decided to take a break, to clear my head before continuing. But when I turned away from the desk, I heard something I could not immediately place. A faint, low hum that did not match the overhead lights. It grew steadily, not loud enough to be alarming, but distinct enough that I could pinpoint the direction. It was coming from the radio in the wall. At first, I thought maybe it had been left plugged in or connected to an old internal system, but the device itself was dark. No illuminated dial, no indicator light. It shouldn't have been capable of producing any sound at all. Yet the hum persisted, uneven, almost like breathing filtered through static. I approached cautiously, each step measured, and the hum shifted from a steady tone to something textured, something layered. It reminded me of the audio descriptions in the incident reports, interference not matching standard frequencies. Before I could get close enough to examine it, the sound stopped. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had. I stood there staring at the dormant radio, unable to shake the sense that what I heard was not random. It felt purposeful, as though the building itself had responded to the contents of the box in some way I couldn't articulate. When I finally sat down again, the open folders looked different, not physically, but in the weight they carried. The reports no longer felt like distant paperwork. They felt like warnings. I should have sealed the box then, returned it to the cabinet, requested clarification from someone at the Historical Society before continuing. But curiosity has always outweighed caution in my life, and something about the emptiness of the cabinet, the lack of any label or record of the box's existence, compelled me to continue. I reached inside once more and found something that made my breath hitch. Beneath the folders, pressed flat against the bottom of the box, was a small cassette tape. The label had faded completely, leaving only a blank rectangle of adhesive residue. I turned it over and noticed faint handwritten markings along the edge. A date, 10/14/87. The exact day the road had been officially closed. I didn't have a cassette player in the archive, and even if I had, I wasn't sure I would have dared to listen to it. Something about the tape felt different from the rest of the contents, as though it had been placed there intentionally, not as part of the records but as a message. A final piece of evidence someone wanted stored away but not found. Still, I held it longer than I should have, tracing the faded ink with my thumb, wondering whether the tape contained the last transmission from the unidentified source. A gust of wind pressed against the building then, strong enough to make the thin glass panes in the window rattle. I looked up sharply. The trees outside swayed in a diagonal pattern, almost coordinated, as though reacting to something unseen. That was when I realized how deeply unsettled I had become. Everything in the building felt slightly off balance. The air, the light, the silence, even my own thoughts. But it wasn't until later, long after the incident with the radio, that I understood the full significance of the box without a label. Finding it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment the story had already found me, and I hadn't even stepped foot on Avery Ridge Road yet. I didn't return to the unlabeled box right away the next morning. I told myself I needed distance, needed a clearer head before diving again into whatever history the town had tried to bury. But even as I approached the archive building just after sunrise, I felt the presence of the box like a weight in the back of my mind, subtle but persistent. The air was colder than the previous day, though the forecast hadn't predicted a drop. A thick band of mist lay along the lower slopes of the mountains, moving slowly as though it were alive. The streets of Hickory Pass were nearly empty at that hour, and the few people I did see avoided meeting my eyes. They moved with a quiet urgency, not fearful exactly, but cautious, the kind of caution that grows from shared knowledge never written down. The building looked even duller in the morning light, its exterior paint absorbing color instead of reflecting it. I paused before entering, glancing once toward the road that wound out of the town, disappearing around a bend lined with sycamores. It struck me that the road signs, which I expected to see pointing toward various state routes, had blank metal plates where names should have been. Scratches and small screw holes suggested they had once held directional markers, but now they were empty, directing no one anywhere. Inside, nothing had been disturbed. The folders remained exactly where I left them. The cassette sat atop the pile, the faded date staring up at me. The radio was silent, not simply off but inert, the way an appliance looks after years of neglect. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined the sound the day before, but the impression it had left in my memory was too precise to dismiss. I needed information, something to anchor the unease growing inside me. So, instead of opening the box again, I went to the map room on the opposite side of the building, a space lined with tall flat files, each drawer labeled in thick black ink. The county kept meticulous cartographic records spanning more than a century, and I had seen enough archives to know that even the smallest road would appear in at least one map. Avery Ridge Road had to be somewhere. I started with the most recent maps, working backward. County survey from 2018, no mention. Transportation zoning map from 2009, nothing. A highway realignment diagram from 1996, still nothing. That alone felt wrong. Even decommissioned roads are typically marked with dashed lines or historical notation. When I reached the maps from the early 1980s, the air in the room felt colder, though the temperature gauge on the wall remained unchanged. A laminated topographical chart from 1984 showed several mountain routes, but where Avery Ridge Road should have been, there was only a blank, faintly discolored patch of paper. It was as if something had been erased, but not fully. A ghost of a road that no longer existed, or perhaps was never meant to be seen. That was my first moment of doubt. Not about the road, but about the town itself. Hickory Pass felt old, older than its modest downtown suggested, and the missing road created a cavity in the town's geography that didn't align with the rest of its infrastructure. The more I searched, the more I sensed a pattern emerging. Not simply omission, but intentional absence. By mid-morning, I had found only one map that referenced the road at all. A fragile yellowing county plan from 1979, printed on thin drafting vellum. The line marking Avery Ridge Road was faint, hand-drawn rather than printed, stretching along the spine of a high ridge west of town. The text identifying it was smudged, as though someone had attempted to rub it out, but the name was still legible enough. Avery Ridge Road, Its path led into a dense section of forest, curved in an unnatural, almost cautious arc, then ended abruptly at a circular clearing. Roads rarely ended without purpose. Either it once served a facility that no longer existed, or the map had been altered. I traced the line with my finger. The paper felt brittle beneath my skin, the fibers dry and fragile. Something in that moment, the placement of the road, the way the clearing sat at the end like a destination instead of an accident, made me uneasy in a way the incident reports had not. It felt deliberate. As I placed the map aside, I realized something else. The archive had no records referencing construction, maintenance, or closure of the road except for the single handwritten note buried in the 1987 report. A road without documentation is unusual. A road that appears only once in nearly a century of maps is something else entirely. My stomach knotted, and I returned to my workspace. The unlabeled box sat exactly where I left it, but now it seemed different, as if it had waited for me to learn what little I could before offering anything more. I opened the first folder again, the 1981 disappearance. Once more, the description of the final transmission unsettled me. The report claimed the interference did not match any known frequency range, yet offered no hypothesis, no technical addendum, nothing. Then I noticed something I had missed before. In the margin, near the bottom of the page, someone had written a brief note in pencil. The handwriting was small and compressed, the letters slanting downward. It read only, "Patterns consistent." Consistent with what? There was no additional information, no reference, no citation. Just those two words. I checked the next report. Another tiny pencil note in the margin. Same location. A third folder contained a similar annotation. Not atmospheric. The more I found these scattered notes, the more I sensed they had been written by the same person. Someone who had reviewed the reports after the fact. Someone who understood that all the cases were connected, even if the official documents tried to remain neutral. But why pencil? Why marginal notes instead of formal addendums? It suggested secrecy, or perhaps fear. By the time I reached the 1987 report again, my hands had begun to tremble. The final transmission transcript, chaotic and incomplete as it was, now read differently. Not as a puzzling piece of history, but as part of something larger and far more deliberate. What I hadn't noticed before was the faint impression of erased graphite just below the typed section. Someone had written something there, then rubbed it out carefully. I angled the paper toward the window, letting the light catch the ridges left in the fibers. A few letters emerged, fragmented but unmistakable. Listening. The words struck me with a sharpness I felt physically. Whoever had written it had believed the interference, the unknown source, was not random. It was aware. I found myself staring again at the cassette, the faded date, the blank label. The magnetic tape wound tightly beneath the plastic, a record of something someone had wanted to preserve but not expose. The urge to listen to it grew stronger as the day went on. It felt irrational, reckless even, but there was something about the tape that felt like an answer, or a warning. Still, I needed more information. I needed confirmation that Avery Ridge Road had not simply been erased from records, but from the collective memory of the town. During my lunch break, I walked into Hickory Pass. The town had a quality that was difficult to define. Unchanged, almost suspended. Brick storefronts with faded awnings. A diner with a closed sign permanently hung in its window. An old gas station whose pumps had been wrapped in caution tape for years. Yet the town was not abandoned. People moved quietly between buildings, carrying out small tasks with an air of resignation. I studied the bulletin boards, the street signs, the community postings on the door of the closed library. Nowhere, not once, did the name Avery Ridge appear. It was as though the road had been excised from the town's vocabulary. I stood near the edge of the square, looking up at the western ridge. From below, the mountain looked unremarkable, densely forested, steep in some areas, with a few exposed rock faces catching the afternoon light. Nothing about it suggested the presence of a road once cut into its side. And yet, the absence felt unnatural, a blank space where something should have been. As I headed back to the archive, something else struck me. The few people who crossed my path never looked toward that ridge. Their eyes drifted everywhere else, down the street, toward the town hall, even toward the other mountains, but never to the west. That felt like the biggest clue of all. Not the erased maps, not the missing documentation, not even the handwritten warnings buried in the reports. It was the silence, the collective avoidance, the unspoken agreement to pretend the ridge, and whatever happened on it, did not exist. That kind of silence never grows naturally. It is cultivated. By the time I reached the archive again, the building felt even heavier than before. The daylight had begun to dim, casting long shadows through the narrow windows. My workspace was colder than the rest of the building, though the thermostat remained unchanged. The box waited. The cassette waited. The map with the erased line waited. I sat at the desk, unable to shake the feeling that I had crossed a threshold without realizing it. Maybe it was the notes. Maybe it was the way the townspeople refused to acknowledge the ridge. Maybe it was the whisper of graphite impressions still lingering beneath erased words. But something else had changed. Something subtle yet undeniable. As I settled into the chair, I noticed the radio again. This time, it wasn't making any sound. It wasn't humming. It wasn't alive with static. It was simply turned slightly toward me, not physically. The metal frame was bolted into the wall, but the perception was unmistakable. Its dark, empty dial seemed angled just enough that I felt its focus, as though it had been waiting for me to return to the box, to the tape. I looked at the cassette once more. The plastic gleamed faintly in the dimming light. If the town had erased the road, it was because something had made them erase it. And whatever that was had not disappeared. It was still here, listening. I didn't sleep well that night. The motel I had checked into for my stay in Hickory Pass was functional but worn, and the walls were thin enough that the wind outside seemed to travel straight through them. The building itself sat on a slight incline overlooking the eastern side of town, and from my window, I could see the silhouettes of the mountains layered against the night sky. Every ridge was dark except for the westernmost one, Avery Ridge, which blended so seamlessly into the blackness that it looked carved out of the sky rather than rising from the ground. I tried to focus on anything else. The familiar numbers on my digital clock, the hum of the small refrigerator, the dull glow from the parking lot lights bleeding through the curtains. But the shape of the ridge kept pulling my thoughts back to the box, the cassette, the erased road, and the marginal notes that seemed to warn me before I even understood the danger. Sometime after midnight, I woke abruptly without knowing what had disturbed me. The room was silent. Too silent. Even the wind had paused. I lay there trying to steady my breath, and gradually I realized what had changed. There was static. Faint, intermittent, barely audible, like a radio struggling to locate a distant station. At first, I assumed it came from the motel's old HVAC unit, but when I sat up, the sound wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was coming from the walls. Soft bursts of static, then an irregular crackle, then silence. Always from the left side of the room. Always low, always just loud enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. I pressed my hand against the drywall. It was cool but not vibrating. The static didn't intensify or move. It simply drifted, appearing and disappearing like something searching for a connection. I lay awake until the sky began to pale, unable to shake the feeling that the interference wasn't random, and that it hadn't followed me by accident. By the time I returned to the archive the next morning, exhaustion had dulled my senses, but the unease remained sharp. The building seemed different again, quieter, though the same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. As I walked toward my workspace, I noticed a new detail I hadn't seen before. The radio on the wall had dust trails meaningfully disturbed around the tuning dial, as if it had been touched, as if someone had tried to adjust it. I forced myself to ignore the implication. Machines degrade. Vibrations shift things. Dust falls unpredictably. But the explanation felt flimsy even as I told it to myself. The tuning dial looked as though it had been moved deliberately, the arc of disturbed dust following the curve of the metal. I sat at the desk, opened the folder containing the earliest reports, and forced my mind back into the rhythm of work. But every time my eyes drifted toward the sketchy margins or the erased pencil impressions, my thoughts circled back to the motel wall and the static that seemed to seep from nowhere. Eventually, I could no longer ignore the cassette. Its presence had shifted from curiosity to pressure. It felt as if the longer it sat unplayed, the more the silence around it hummed with expectation. I needed a player, something old enough to handle a tape recorded in 1987. The archive had none, but the town's thrift store at the far end of Main Street might. I left the building reluctantly, feeling the air grow colder as I approached the exit, as if the walls themselves objected to me leaving with the intention of learning more. The sky outside was overcast. The clouds stretched into thin gray sheets, A few people moved along the sidewalks, their faces drawn, their pace brisk. Again, no one looked toward Avery Ridge, not even by accident. It almost seemed intentional, the way their gazes slid away from the western mountains before settling anywhere else. The thrift store was cramped, packed with mismatched furniture and fading clothing, shelves of outdated electronics stacked along the back wall. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. After searching for several minutes, I found a portable tape player buried beneath a stack of VHS rewinder units. The device was scratched, the buttons stiff, but the battery compartment was clean enough and the spool wheels turned freely. It would work. I brought it back to the archive, ignoring the persistent feeling that I was being observed, not by a person, but by the town itself. The mountains, the roads, the empty signs, the silence of the townspeople, all of it felt connected, as though Hickory Pass was guarding something, pushing back in quiet ways against anyone who approached its buried truths. Inside my workspace, the air felt heavier again, settling around me in a way that bordered on oppressive. Before I even removed the cassette from the box, I noticed something I hadn't expected at all. The radio's dial had moved again, this time unmistakably. The indicator line, which had been centered over a dead frequency the day before, now hovered slightly right, pointing directly at a band labeled with faint, nearly unreadable numbers. Numbers that didn't correspond to any standard AM or FM station. A non-broadcast range. A range meant for nothing. Or perhaps meant for something the public was never supposed to hear. I touched the tuning knob lightly. Cold metal. No static. No hum. No explanation. My heart pounded in a slow, heavy rhythm as I placed the cassette player on the desk. The act of inserting the tape felt ceremonial, like crossing a boundary that had been waiting for me since the moment I opened the unlabeled box. When the tape clicked into place, I hesitated. The silence around me deepened, and even the overhead lights seemed to buzz more faintly. The world narrowed to the weight of my thumb hovering over the play button. I pressed it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a soft hiss. The sound was uneven, wavering, almost breathing. At first, I thought the tape was degraded, the magnetic strip damaged over time, but the hiss began to form a pattern. Subtle, recurring, too deliberate to be random. A rise, a fall, a brief interruption. It reminded me of tidal motion, slow and cyclical. Then the static began. Not chaotic, not the sharp, jagged bursts of interference I had heard in old recordings. This static flowed. It moved with purpose, a long swell, a narrow thread, a flicker of something beneath the noise. It was unlike any interference I had ever heard. Deeper, thicker, almost dimensional. And then came the sound that made my skin tighten, a faint tone within the static. Not a voice, not words, a tone, a single note repeating at irregular intervals as if responding to something far away. The tape's counterwheel turned steadily, and I leaned closer, trying to isolate the pattern. But the longer I listened, the more unsettled I became. The tone wasn't only within the tape. The radio on the wall began to vibrate gently. It didn't turn on. The dial didn't light. But the metal casing vibrated in perfect sync with the tone coming through the cassette player, as though the radio recognized the frequency and was responding. I paused the tape immediately. The vibration ceased. The room fell back into oppressive silence, like the air was holding its breath. I replayed the same section, and again the tone emerged from the static, and again the radio responded. The vibration was stronger this time, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a tremor up my arm when I touched the radio's surface. My rational mind fought for explanations. Harmonic resonance, faulty wiring, coincidence. But each one fell apart the moment I considered the consistency. The radio did not react to any other part of the tape. Only the tone, only that frequency. I rewound the tape and listened again, this time paying attention to the background. Beneath the static, beneath the tone, was something faint. A softness, a shape. Not a sound I could identify, but a presence. Something just beyond my ability to interpret. Something that felt aware. My breathing became shallow. The hairs on my arms rose. I stopped the tape and sat back, trying to steady myself. But the silence when the tone ended felt wrong. Not empty. Waiting. I forced myself to analyze what I'd heard. The pattern of the tone repeated with slight variations, almost like an encoded message. but the intervals weren't consistent with standard modulation techniques used in emergency channels or experimental communication. It belonged to no known structure. The marginal notes in the reports repeated in my mind. Patterns consistent, not atmospheric. Listening, I felt myself slipping into an irrational certainty. The tape wasn't just documenting something that happened on Avery Ridge Road. It was participating in it, replicating it, recalling it, preserving it. My attention shifted back to the radio. The tuning dial still pointed at the blank range, the range that matched nothing. And yet, the moment I touched the knob again, a small flicker in the corner of my vision made me freeze. For the briefest instant, the indicator needle moved on its own, barely a millimeter. So slight that if I hadn't been staring directly at it, I could have dismissed it. But I saw it. The motion was real, intentional. I stepped back slowly, pulse thudding against my ribs. The tape, the radio, the static in the motel wall. Everything pointed to one conclusion I didn't want to say aloud, even in thought. The frequency wasn't just anomalous. It was active. Somewhere, somehow, it was still transmitting. Maybe from the ridge, maybe from the road. Maybe from whatever had caused the disappearances. And the archive, the motel, the radio in my workspace. They weren't sources. They were receivers. I realized then that I needed to know exactly where that frequency came from. And the only place that made sense, the one place tied to every report, every disappearance, every erased mark on the map, was Avery Ridge Road. I wasn't ready to go there. Not yet. But something told me that whether I went by choice or not, the road was already pulling me toward it. The static in the motel wall, the radio that adjusted itself, the tape that seemed to breathe. No known frequency behaved this way, which meant the source wasn't unknown by accident. It was unknown because it wasn't meant to be found. Not by the public, not by the authorities, not by anyone who might understand what it truly was. But it had found me anyway. And it wasn't finished, not even close. I told myself I wouldn't bring the tape back to the motel. I told myself it was safer in the archive, locked in the cabinet with the other records, confined to a building built to house ghosts of history. But when I stood at the door at the end of that day, lights dimmed, the echo of my footsteps folding into the empty corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the cassette behind would be the same as leaving a question half-asked. I slipped it into my bag anyway. The sky outside was already dark. In small towns like Hickory Pass, night didn't spread gradually. It dropped all at once, like a stage curtain falling between one breath and the next. The streetlights cast pale circles on the cracked pavement, and the air had taken on that sharp metallic chill that announces the approach of a colder season. As I walked back toward the motel, I could see only the suggestion of the mountains, silhouettes piled on silhouettes. Avery Ridge hid within the darkness like an absence more than a shape. I tried not to look in that direction. It was only a line of trees on stone, the rational part of my mind insisted. Just another piece of geography. Nothing more. Yet the thought did nothing to slow the pulse in my neck as I passed the last intersection before the motel. Inside my room, the quiet felt different from the night before. It was not the cushioned stillness of a cheap roadside building, but something tighter, compressed, as if the air had thickened just enough to resist movement. I set my bag on the small table beside the bed and stood still for several seconds, listening. The refrigerator hummed softly. The heater clicked on. No static in the walls. For a moment, that absence almost disappointed me. I unpacked the tape player and the cassette, placing them on the table. The object looked harmless there, its plastic casing reflecting a muted rectangle of light from the bedside lamp. Nothing about it suggested what it contained, or how the old radio in the archive seemed to recognize the frequency recorded on it. I told myself I would not play it. Not tonight, not alone. I had already pushed further than common sense recommended. I could catalog, I could document, I could write notes and construct timelines. But putting myself in direct contact with whatever the tape carried, in a room that did not belong to me, in a town that refused to look at its own western ridge, that crossed an invisible line. So instead, I opened my notebook. I began with the dates of the disappearances, listing them in a neat column. 1981, 1983, 1985, 1987. I traced patterns in the months, the seasons, the recorded weather, the reported time of last contact. Small consistencies emerged. Late evenings, poor visibility, increased cloud coverage. It was the kind of pattern an investigator might call circumstantial but noteworthy. Then I added what the official reports refused to classify: the interference. Every case mentioned it in some way. The presence of noise not attributed to equipment malfunction, weather conditions, or known radio sources. Every marginal pencil note had treated it as central rather than incidental. As I wrote, I realized something that made the pen pause in my hand. None of the reports described the interference as random. They described it with language reserved for living things: growing, concentrated, persistent. It did not simply occur, it escalated, just as it seemed to be escalating around me. I closed the notebook and leaned back, listening again. The refrigerator, the heater, the distant sound of a truck on the highway. Normal, explainable, routine. Still, the awareness of the tape on the table pressed against the back of my mind like a weight. Eventually, fatigue overtook anxiety. I placed the cassette back into my bag, turned off the lamp, and lay down. The darkness settled heavy across the room, broken only by the faint red numerals of the clock radio on the bedside stand. I watched the numbers shift, each minute dragging longer than the last, and gradually, my thoughts began to slip into the indistinct haze that precedes sleep. Don't know how long I was out before I woke again, but when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the clock. The numbers were gone. The red digital display, steady and reliable when I closed my eyes, had been replaced by a single horizontal line of unfocused light flickering faintly. For several seconds, I stared at it, disoriented, wondering if the power had flickered or if the unit was failing. Then I became aware of a new sound. Static, not in the walls this time. It was coming from the clock itself. The device wasn't designed to emit static. It was a simple digital unit with a radio function, but that radio should have remained silent unless manually activated. Yet there it was, a low, uneven wash of sound, so quiet that at first I thought my mind was fabricating it. I reached toward the clock to confirm the radio was off. Before my fingers touched it, the static rose slightly in volume. I froze. The change was subtle, but distinct. The sound reacted to movement, or at least seemed to. Very slowly, I pulled my hand back. The static softened again. I lay there in the dark, heartbeat loud enough in my ears that it almost masked the sound. Almost. I tested the pattern again, raising my hand just enough to cast a faint shadow over the clock. The static responded with another intangible shift, like a whisper adjusting itself to be heard. The realization that I wasn't dealing with random interference settled in my chest like a stone. I turned on the bedside lamp. The static stopped. The red numbers returned, sharp and unmoving, as though they had always been there. The heater hummed. The refrigerator clicked. The truck noise outside resumed its distant rhythm. Everything ordinary reassembled itself around me, and for a moment I wondered if I had been dreaming. But one detail shattered that possibility. My bag, which I had left closed on the table, was open. The cassette player sat beside it, and the cassette, which I knew I had placed inside the bag, lay next to the player, its title edge facing the clock. My body tensed with a cold, specific kind of fear. Not the kind that flares and burns itself out, but the kind that roots in the muscles and refuses to release them. I scanned the room quickly. The door was latched. The chain was in place. The bathroom was empty. No sign of forced entry. No footprint on the thin carpet. Nothing to suggest anyone had been in the room. Nothing unless the interference itself counted as someone. I tried to reverse engineer a rational explanation. Maybe I had opened the bag in half sleep without remembering. Maybe I had planned to listen to the tape and then changed my mind. Sleep can erase small sequences of action, but it couldn't have turned the clock radio on and off without pressing any buttons. It couldn't have caused the static to rise and fall in response to my movements. And it couldn't have aligned the cassette so precisely that its edge faced the clock, like a device oriented toward another receiver. My gaze moved from the tape to the radio display and back again. A thought surfaced, unwelcome yet unavoidable. Maybe the frequency on the tape was not just being replayed when I pressed play. Maybe it was leaking. Maybe it was active even in stillness. I did not touch the cassette. Instead, I picked up the tape player itself and examined the controls. The power switch was off. The battery compartment closed. No movement, no vibration, no reason for it to interact with anything in the room. Yet I could still feel a faint charge in the air, a low, almost mechanical tension, like the moment before a storm when the atmosphere thickens and hairs lift from the skin. I turned off the lamp. The numbers on the clock remained visible, casting a faint red glow across the tabletop. I lay back down, forcing myself to slow my breathing, to anchor each inhalation and exhalation in the count of the digits shifting minute by minute. 12:41, 12:42, 12:43. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as my body began to loosen slightly, the static returned. Soft at first, almost gentle. A faint hiss layered beneath the machine hum of the room, perfectly timed with the minutes rolling forward. This time, however, it did not come from the walls or from an undefined source. It pulsed directly from the clock. The red display flickered in rhythm with the sound, not erratically, but with an unmistakable pattern, as though responding to something external. I watched as the digits blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again, synced to the invisible waves moving through the room. My hand moved toward the lamp switch. At that exact moment, a new element entered the static. A tone, soft, low, but identical in character to the one I had heard on the tape earlier that day. The same single note that had caused the old archive radio to vibrate. It emerged slowly, carrying a faint resonance that seemed to press against the inside of my ears more than travel through them. The moment the tone appeared, the clock's display shifted. The numbers did not advance to the next minute. They froze. 12:47. The static continued. The tone repeated, separated by intervals that were not quite regular. I felt my pulse accelerate, but the passage of time in the room no longer matched the numbers in front of me. I glanced at my phone on the nightstand. Its screen remained dark, but I knew if I reached for it, my hand would shake. Instead, I listened. The static rose and fell. The tone repeated. Something about its cadence felt wrong. Not like a signal searching for a receiver, but like a signal acknowledging one. Not calling out. Responding. The thought formed slowly, uncoiling from the tension in my muscles. The first night, the static had seeped from the walls like an environmental fluke. The second day, the tape had triggered resonance in the archive radio. But this felt like the other side of a conversation. The motel room was not just catching fragments, it was answering back. I became aware of my own breathing then, the way my chest rose and fell, the rhythm steady but louder than it should have been. As I focused on the sound of air moving in and out of my lungs, something disturbing happened. The tone began to mirror it. Whenever my inhalation quickened, the tone arrived sooner. Whenever I forced my breathing to slow, the tone took longer to return. It was as if the frequency had latched onto my internal rhythm and was adjusting itself to match. The room, the clock, the tape in my open bag, all of it blurred into one awareness. I was no longer just an observer of the interference. I was part of the pattern. I do not remember making the decision to move. One moment I lay there listening to the interplay of breath and tone, and the next I was reaching for the lamp switch with a sharp panicked motion. The moment light flooded the room, everything stopped. The static cut off mid-hiss. The tone vanished. The red numbers on the clock jumped to a new time. 12:59, not 12:48 or 12:49 or any of the minutes that should have followed. A full 12 minutes had passed between the last number I saw and the one now displayed. Yet my sense of time placed the gap somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. I stared at the clock until my eyes blurred. Eventually I stood, picked up the cassette and placed it back in the player. My hands shook. I walked to the small motel dresser and slid the player into the top drawer, covering it with a folded towel, as if that thin barrier could muffle something that was clearly not bound by wood or fabric. I did not sleep again. I sat in the chair by the window until dawn, watching the horizon lighten, the black outline of the mountains reappear, the ridge of Avery take its place once more among the others. It looked ordinary, trees, stone, a line separating sky from earth. But now I knew that whatever had happened on that road had not ended with the barricades. Whatever had reached through the radios of disappearing drivers, whatever had been captured accidentally on the tape, whatever had caused someone to fill margins with warnings and then erase them, it was still active, and it had finally done more than let itself be recorded. It had answered, not in words, not in a voice, but through time skipping on a cheap clock radio in a motel room in a town that refused to say the name of its western ridge. I realized then that avoiding Avery Ridge Road might no longer be an option, because whatever was there had already found its way to me. The morning after the clock radio froze 12 minutes out of existence, the world looked almost normal again. Almost. From the outside, the motel seemed unchanged. Peeling paint, uneven parking lot, a soda machine with a sun-faded logo humming at the edge of the walkway. Cars came and went with the same indifferent rhythm. The air had the brittle clarity of late October, and the clouds drifted lazily across a washed-out sky. But something in my perception had shifted. The ordinary details felt staged, as if the town had dressed itself in familiar textures to distract from the frequency just beneath the surface. I left the cassette player inside the motel room. I didn't lock it in a safe or bury it or throw it away. I slipped it into the top drawer under the towel again, aware of how useless that barrier really was. Still, the small act of concealment gave me enough of a mental buffer to step outside. The walk to the archive felt different. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, yet every sound carried a faint echo of last night's static. The rumble of a truck, the squeak of a sign in the wind, the far-off murmur of voices I couldn't quite hear. My mind filtered them all through the memory of that tone, the one that had synchronized with my breathing. I found myself scanning the faces of the people I passed, searching for any sign that they sensed what I did. Most carried a particular expression I had come to recognize in small, remote towns. Tight focus on mundane tasks, shoulders slightly hunched, attention anchored firmly to what was in front of them. But here, there was an extra layer, a practiced avoidance of something unseen. No one looked up at the ridge. No one looked at the sky. No one lingered near the edges of town where the roads bent toward the mountains. At a crosswalk, as I waited for a pickup to pass, I noticed something else. On the far side of the street stood a notice board with local announcements, events, church schedules, seasonal warnings. Mixed among them was a paper printed with county road maintenance information. Several route numbers were listed. One had been blacked out with thick marker, the ink pressed so hard it had wrinkled the paper. The space beside it, where the road name should have been, had been carefully torn away. I stared at the jagged edge longer than necessary, then forced myself to move on. The pattern had become familiar, references erased without being fully removed, as if the town couldn't decide whether to forget or simply hide. By the time I reached the archive, the vague dread in my chest had sharpened into a more specific anticipation. I knew I needed more than old reports and anomalous recordings now. I needed to hear from someone who lived through the period when Avery Ridge Road was still open. Someone whose silence might reveal more than their words. I didn't expect that person to walk through the front door before I even reached my desk. The sheriff's presence filled the entrance in a way that seemed disproportionate to his size. He wasn't particularly tall or broad, but there was a solidity to the way he stood, like he had been rooted in this town long enough that the land itself reinforced his posture. His uniform was clean but worn at the seams, the kind of wear that comes not from neglect but from long use. A badge glinted faintly on his chest, dulled by years of handling. His hair was mostly gray, cut short, and his face had the kind of lined stillness that suggested he'd learned, long ago, how to control what it revealed. He signed the visitor log with deliberate strokes, then glanced toward the interior of the building. His gaze didn't wander, didn't drift among the shelves like someone casually examining their surroundings. It moved with intention, searching for something, or someone. For a moment, I considered stepping back out of sight. I had nothing to hide. Not in any official sense, but the instinct rose anyway. Before I could act on it, his gaze found me. There was no surprise in his expression. If anything, there was the resigned familiarity of a person seeing something they had expected to appear. He walked toward me with unhurried steps, pausing only once to glance almost imperceptibly at the cinder block addition that housed my workspace. The motion was small, but it sharpened my focus. He knew which part of the building mattered. As he approached, I noticed a detail that unsettled me more than his presence alone. He wasn't carrying any paperwork. Most visits to archives from local law enforcement involved forms, requests, or official notices, something to justify their appearance. The sheriff had come empty-handed. He greeted me, but I barely registered the words. What struck me instead was the way his eyes moved past me to the open door of my workspace. He lingered on the edge of the view, his gaze snagging briefly on the corner of my desk where the unlabeled box had sat the previous days. A small muscle in his jaw tightened. In that moment, I understood something. He had seen the box before. Maybe not recently, maybe not in this exact configuration. But there was recognition there, not curiosity. Recognition tinged with something close to reluctance. He asked how I was settling in. Neutral questions, nothing that could be interpreted as more than polite check-in from a local authority. I answered as evenly as I could, focusing on the mechanics of my work, the state of the records, the condition of the facility. His expression remained unreadable. It was what he didn't ask that mattered. He didn't ask what I was working on specifically. He didn't ask whether any unusual documents had surfaced. He didn't ask if I needed help understanding local geography or historical context. But he did ask one thing, in a way that sounded offhand but landed with unmistakable weight. He asked how the building felt at night. The question struck me harder than it should have. On the surface, it could have been about safety or discomfort. Old buildings creak, long hours can be unsettling. Yet the way he posed it, with a slight pause beforehand, told me he was really asking something else, not whether the building was safe, whether it was quiet, whether it was still, whether it behaved. I answered cautiously, staying close to the truth without confessing more than I wanted to. I mentioned the aging infrastructure, the flicker of the lights, the way the rooms seemed to hold sound longer than normal. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly at that last detail. He told me, in measured, indirect terms, that some places in town were better avoided if I worked late. Not because of crime, he implied, but because of poor visibility, winding roads, wildlife, practical concerns, sensible ones. He spoke of the mountains as if they were merely terrain, inconvenient rather than threatening. But every time his words drifted toward the western side of town, where the road outcurved toward the ridge, his gaze shifted away from mine. He looked at the floor, at the doorframe, at a random stack of cardboard boxes near the wall, anywhere but toward the west. The warning came wrapped in banality. He suggested sticking to the main routes, avoiding back roads after dark, assuming I was unfamiliar with the area. To anyone else, it would have sounded like the ordinary caution of a lawman trying to keep an outsider from getting lost. But I had spent the last days tracing a road that no longer existed on maps, listening to a tape that made an old radio vibrate, and watching a clock freeze time at the exact moment a tone synchronized with my breathing. His casual warning did not feel casual. It felt targeted. He didn't name Avery Ridge Road. He didn't even allude to it directly. But when he described the roads to avoid, he did so in a way that mapped perfectly onto the erased line from the 1979 survey map. A reference point here, a direction there, a mention of a fork that no longer officially existed. To anyone else, his words would have painted a vague picture of hard-to-navigate routes. To me, it outlined a path I had only seen in faint ink and marginalia. I realized then that he wasn't just telling me to be careful. He was testing how much I already knew. He asked then how far into the archive I had gotten, how many years back, whether I had reached the late 80s yet. The question was posed lightly, as though he were making conversation about the scope of my assignment. The moment I mentioned 1987, something tightened in his posture. His shoulders drew in slightly. His fingers flexed once at his side. For a brief second, I saw a crack in the practiced neutrality. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was close. A weary, cautious dread that comes from living for decades with a truth no one else once spoken. He told me that year had been hard on the town. He didn't say why, he didn't have to. The image rose unbidden, the date on the cassette, the note about the road's closure, the final transmission transcript that ended with unknown source preceding termination. I remembered the erased pencil word, listening, and the way the sheriff now stood in front of me, speaking around something instead of about it. He didn't ask if I had found the box. He didn't ask if I had found the tape. He didn't ask if I had heard the frequency. Those omissions were louder than any question. Our conversation remained on the surface, but beneath it, a second conversation unfolded silently. His eyes tracked my reactions when he referenced the ridge without naming it. I had the sense he was trying to decide something. How much to say, whether to intervene, whether I was already too far into something that couldn't be safely unwound. At one point, he glanced toward the interior of the building, his gaze lingering on the cinder block wall as if he were listening for something. Then he shifted his weight and looked back at me with a resigned expression that I did not understand fully until much later. He told me, in the same calm, practical tone he'd used for everything else, that this town expected visitors to finish their work and leave, on time, without detours. Not a threat, not even directly a warning. It sounded like advice shaped by experience. People who stayed longer, he implied, had trouble leaving. The way he phrased it could have applied to any number of mundane factors. Jobs drying up, families pulling them back home, the slow gravity of small-town inertia. That was the surface interpretation, the one that wouldn't raise eyebrows in any official record. But after nights of static in motel walls and radios that responded to dead frequencies, I heard something else in his words. People who entangled themselves with the wrong parts of the town had trouble escaping. Maybe not physically. Maybe in ways no one wanted to put into writing. Before he left, he did something that unsettled me more than his presence or his carefully worded cautions. He stepped closer to my workspace doorway and looked into the room. Not a casual glance, but a slow, deliberate scan. His gaze landed briefly on the spot where the unlabeled box had been, then on the wall where the old radio was mounted. His face remained composed, but his eyes hardened. It was the look of someone recognizing a configuration they had hoped never to see again. He didn't step across the threshold. He didn't touch anything. He simply stood in the doorway for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if verifying that what he feared was true. Something about the room's arrangement, the contents on the desk, the very alignment of the walls, meant something to him. I realized with a small jolt that the box likely hadn't just been overlooked for years. It had been avoided, deliberately, until someone like me, unaware of its significance, opened the cabinet and disturbed the equilibrium. Before turning away, the sheriff looked at me one last time, and in that moment, the layers of practiced authority and small-town politeness stripped away just enough for me to see something raw beneath. He was tired, not the tired of long hours or bureaucratic strain. The tired of a man who had spent decades standing between his town and something it refused to acknowledge, holding back whatever he could, knowing it was already too late for some. He left with a nod that could have meant anything. Respect, resignation, a final attempt at guidance. As the door closed behind him, the building seemed to exhale. The fluorescent lights in my workspace flickered once, twice, then steadied. In the quiet that followed, the old radio on the wall looked darker than before. I went back to the box, to the folders, to the tape-shaped absence on the desk. The sheriff had not told me to stop. He had not ordered me away from specific records or formally requested I limit my review. That would have created a trail, a question, an official acknowledgement of the thing no one wanted named. Instead, he had given me something worse than a command. He had given me a choice. Continue down the path I had started along, cataloging, listening, tracing the erased road, or walk away before whatever had followed those missing drivers found its way fully into my life. It would have been easy to close the box then, to reseal the past and treat the sheriff's visit as a final, unspoken line in the sand. To tell myself I was here to process records, not excavate the town's buried traumas. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the motel clock frozen at 12:47, the numbers held captive by a tone that seemed to breathe with my lungs. I saw the tape's date, 10/14/87, and the erased pencil word. I saw the sheriff's gaze tracking the radio in my workspace like it was a loaded weapon no one had ever disarmed. He had warned me without explaining why, and somehow, that made the pull of the ridge even stronger. Because in my experience, people only hide what still has the power to hurt them. The sheriff's visit lingered long after he left. Not in the way someone's presence tends to settle in a room. No, it was different. His departure seemed to close the space more than open it, like an invisible pressure shifting from one direction to another. I could feel the absence of his warning in the way the air felt thicker than usual, as if the space between the walls had somehow filled with the weight of unspoken things. I had told myself that I would continue the investigation into Avery Ridge Road, that it was only a matter of cataloging and piecing together the records, cross-referencing the maps and the reports, and compiling the data until something clear emerged. But after the sheriff's brief, deliberate conversation, something shifted in my approach. He hadn't given me a direct order, but his veiled caution had instilled a subtle urgency. I had crossed some invisible line, not because of my interest in the closed road, but because of what that road represented. It wasn't simply a road. It was a boundary. A boundary the town, the sheriff, the archive, all had spent decades trying to maintain, whether by avoidance or by erasure. I couldn't stop myself now. I had to see it through. The 1987 report was where everything had started, and I knew it held the key to understanding the closure. I had already glanced at it briefly, but I hadn't dug deep. I'd avoided it, to be honest. Something in its finality had repelled me. The road, the disappearances, the final transmission, all of it had been sealed with that one document. But I couldn't afford to let it sit in the file any longer. The document was a formal record, a report stamped in official ink, all neat lines and legal language. It didn't stand out against the others except for the note at the end. Road permanently closed 10/14/87 due to public safety concerns. I had seen it before, but this time, as I retrieved the file from the shelf, I noticed something different. The folder felt heavier than the others. I opened it, and instead of a single page, there were several more inside. The corners turned down as though someone had hastily shoved them in. I pulled them out one by one, careful not to damage the brittle paper. At first glance, everything seemed routine. A report of closure, a series of surveys, some internal communications between the county and the state. They spoke of erosion, of road degradation, and of danger to public safety. The usual explanations, the ones no one ever questions until the road itself disappears from the map. But something about the signatures at the bottom of the final pages made my hand pause. They were all initialed, but not by people, by departments. The Environmental Safety Bureau, the State Highway Maintenance Office, the Public Works Task Force. Each of them had approved the decision, one after the other, but there were no names attached, no signatures, no personal responsibility, only titles. A series of indelible rubber stamps, followed by the word approved. I flipped through the pages more quickly now. I knew there had to be something more, some internal contradiction, some forgotten piece of the puzzle. The page that struck me was buried near the middle, tucked behind a plain report on the road's condition. It was a small, handwritten note in red ink. The handwriting was cramped and slanted, barely legible, but the message was clear. Removal of data critical to public awareness is necessary. Document will be closed immediately upon completion. Public safety overrides. The rest of the note was smeared, as though someone had wiped the page clean, but the meaning was still unmistakable. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove information from the report, to scrub it clean, as if something crucial had been buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and legalese. But they hadn't been entirely successful. The red ink still remained, faint but undeniable. I pulled out another folder, one that had been stuck beneath the stack of closure papers. This one was thinner, marked with urgent stamped across the top. I hadn't noticed it before, and I was careful as I unfolded the contents. At first glance, it was a memorandum, a meeting transcript from the town council, dated 2 weeks before the official closure order. The text was brief, consisting mostly of formalities, but one line stood out. The Ridge Incident. Discussion of information leakage concerning road closure. Immediate action to prevent further awareness. I felt the blood drain from my face. The Ridge Incident. I hadn't seen that phrase anywhere else in the archive, not until now. The word incident was vague, intentionally so, but it carried an ominous weight. Whoever had written it clearly intended to bury any trace of it. I looked over the memo again, as if reading it differently would reveal more. But there was nothing, no details, no follow-up, no explanation for why this incident had been deemed so critical to seal away. I could only infer that it was tied to the closure of Avery Ridge Road, something so significant that it warranted the erasure of public knowledge. I was so engrossed in the file that I didn't notice the time passing. The sun had already sunk lower in the sky when I snapped the folder shut, the weight of the information sinking into my chest. The pieces were coming together, but it only raised more questions. I had learned enough to know that I couldn't just leave this in the archive. The 1987 closure wasn't just a matter of public safety or road erosion. It was a response to something that had happened on the ridge, something the town had wanted to forget, something tied to the missing drivers. And it was clear now that this was not just an accident or a mistake. The town had known, the sheriff had known, and now I was beginning to see it too. But knowing didn't feel like power. It felt like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something much larger than missing road records and vanished townspeople. There was a deep pull toward the ridge, and no matter how many records I went through, no matter how many locked doors I opened, I knew that the only way to understand what had really happened was to go there. But even the thought of it made my skin crawl. Something was still buried on that road. Something wasn't finished. I had to keep pushing. I had no choice. But I had also learned one other thing from the sheriff's visit. There were limits. There were lines drawn in the sand that no one was meant to cross. Lines that led to the ridge. And once I crossed them, there would be no turning back. I told myself all morning that I wasn't going to do it. That despite everything I had uncovered, the erased maps, the redacted closure files, the sheriff's unspoken warnings, I was still only an archivist on a temporary contract, not an investigator, Not someone who needed to venture beyond the boundaries of what could be explained in ink and paper. But boundaries meant very little now. The tape, the static in the motel room, the way the radio in the archive responded to frequencies that shouldn't have existed. All of it pushed against the edges of caution until they fractured. By the time late afternoon settled over Hickory Pass, a thin veil of gold clinging to rooftops and the tree line, I understood that avoiding Avery Ridge Road was no longer a real option. Avoiding it simply meant waiting for whatever was on it to find another way to reach me. And it already had. I drove out of town quietly, the way someone leaves a place not wanting to draw attention. I had looked up the last accessible intersection before the road disappeared from modern records. A small fork at the edge of Hickory Pass, now marked only as a maintenance route. On every digital map it ended abruptly, as if the satellite images couldn't resolve what lay beyond. The sheriff's vague warnings replayed in my mind as I followed the main road west. The way he refrained from naming the place. The way his eyes avoided any reference to the ridge. All of it confirmed that I was entering territory even the town refused to acknowledge. Clouds gathered low as I drove, dimming the late afternoon light until the mountains darkened into vague silhouettes. The road narrowed gradually, the asphalt shifting from freshly patched to old and cracked, the center paint fading into ghost-like fragments. The trees thickened on both sides, growing taller the farther I went, as though forming a natural corridor leading me onward. The further west I drove, the fewer signs I saw, then none at all. The air changed too. It felt denser, as though infused with static before sound. Not noise, but the anticipation of it. The same charged quiet I'd felt in the motel room before the clock began responding to the tone. My hands tightened on the steering wheel without my realizing it. A narrow lane broke off to the right, barely visible beneath overgrown brush. My navigation app showed nothing but blank terrain. No route number, no label. Yet I knew I had found the old junction point, the last remaining artifact of the erased road. I slowed the car, gravel crunching under the tires. Despite everything I had read, the countless clues, the years of missing records, I had expected more. A sign, a barricade, something. But the fork stood unmarked, as if the road had never been meant to be seen. I sat there for several seconds, engine idling, the cold air seeping through the vents. The sun had nearly vanished behind the ridge, its last fragments catching in the branches overhead. I had no idea what I expected to happen. Then I turned onto the road. The sensation was immediate. Not physical, not environmental. Something deeper. Like crossing into a pocket of air that had been sealed off for decades. The car slowed without my foot touching the brake. The engine hum dampened as if swallowed by the forest. I checked the odometer, out of reflex, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted a record of distance. Something tangible to reassure myself that movement still meant progress. The road surface deteriorated quickly. Asphalt cracked into jagged segments, seams lined with moss. The center line had faded entirely. Overhanging trees blocked most of the remaining daylight. Every few meters, the car passed through patches of deeper shadow that seemed to cool the air instantly. I rolled down the window an inch, expecting to hear typical forest sounds. Wind, birds, insects. But the forest was silent. Completely silent. The absence was unnatural. After a few minutes, I noticed another detail. I wasn't encountering any branches, debris, or fallen logs across the road. For a route abandoned since 1987, untouched by maintenance crews, the path was surprisingly, impossibly, clear. As if something kept it that way. The deeper I drove, the more the world behind me felt distant. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as though expecting to see something following me. But each time I looked, the entrance of the road was gone. The trees behind the car seemed to have closed ranks, erasing the way back. It was irrational, I told myself. Forests grow, vines shift, shadows move. Still, the idea that the road was subtly reshaping itself behind me dug into the back of my thoughts. I kept driving. The road curved gradually to the left, exactly as the old 1979 map had shown. That alone sent a chill through me. The map had felt almost mythical in its fragility. And now here I was, tracing its faded line with my car. The ridge rose ahead, a dark shape against the fading sky. The forest canopy thinned briefly, allowing a sliver of light to strike the road. For a moment I caught sight of something silver embedded in the asphalt. I slowed, leaned forward. It was a piece of metal, something torn, rusted, but unmistakably machine-made. a fragment of a vehicle. My stomach tightened. I didn't stop. I didn't want to see anything more clearly than that. Minutes passed, measured not by the clock but by the increasing tension in my body. Every nerve felt tuned to an unseen frequency. Then came the first sound. Soft, barely there. A faint, intermittent crackle drifting through the car, like static leaking into the air itself. I turned off the radio immediately. The sound continued. It wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from the road. The static rose and fell as I drove, faint at first, then pulsing in short bursts. I reached for my phone, intending to record it, but the screen flickered with low brightness, even though the battery was over half. The signal icon vanished. The device vibrated once, a short, sharp tremor, then went dark. I placed it on the passenger seat, my pulse quickening. The static deepened, no longer faint but layered, dense, like the tape's recording. The exact same texture, the same unnatural quality. I slowed the car, gripping the wheel tightly, and that's when I saw something up ahead. Not a figure, not a person, not movement, just a change in the light. A faint glint, almost metallic, in a clearing farther along the curve. The place where the road ended, the place the map showed, the same circular clearing where the road terminated without explanation. The static grew richer, swelling into something that felt less like sound and more like pressure. My ears popped, once, then again. My breath grew shallow and I realized I had been unconsciously synchronizing its rhythm with the rising and falling waves of interference. Just like the night in the motel. I forced myself to break the pattern. I inhaled sharply, irregularly. The static dipped briefly, almost reactively. The correlation made my skin crawl. As the clearing came into full view, I slowed to a near stop. The trees opened up, revealing a circular stretch of broken ground, the remnants of pavement scattered like fossilized fragments. At the far edge of the clearing sat something metallic and dark, half submerged in dirt and leaves. A vehicle, or what remained of one. Its frame was twisted, rusted, hollow. Decades old, maybe longer. Time had stripped it down to its skeleton, but the shape was unmistakable. A car. A model I didn't recognize immediately, but definitely older than the 1980s. The static intensified. Something about the clearing felt wrong, not threatening in the usual physical sense, but wrong in the way that air feels before lightning strikes when the world holds its breath. I stepped out of the car. The silence of the forest hit me instantly. No wind, no birds, no distant noise. The static seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the clearing like some kind of atmospheric pulse. Then I noticed something that stopped me cold. Near the pile of rusted metal, half buried in soil and leaves, was a radio antenna. Not connected to anything, just standing upright as if placed there deliberately. The static throbbed in time with it. I approached slowly, every instinct warning me against it, yet unable to stop. The air around the antenna felt charged, a faint vibration humming against my skin. When I got close enough to see the metal surface clearly, I froze. Etched into its base, worn but legible, were numbers. Numbers that matched the tuning position the old wall-mounted radio had shifted toward in the archive. The same impossible frequency, the same blank range that no broadcast should have occupied, the same band the tape had triggered. My chest tightened. Then, behind me, my car radio turned on. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. The car sat on the edge of the clearing exactly where I had left it. The headlights dimmed slightly, and from inside, through the closed doors, through the windows, I heard it. The tone. The same one that had synchronized with my breathing. The same one that had vibrated the motel clock. The same one embedded in the cassette. It pulsed from the car radio as though transmitted from beneath the ground itself. My breath hitched, and the tone wavered in perfect response. That was when I understood the truth, or at least part of it. Whatever had been transmitting on Avery Ridge Road hadn't stopped in 1987. It hadn't faded. It hadn't weakened. It was active. It had been active all along. The disappearances hadn't ended because the road was closed. They had ended because the road was erased. But the source was still here, still transmitting, still listening. The pulse deepened as I stood frozen in the clearing. For a moment I thought I saw something in the air, a faint ripple, a distortion, as though the atmosphere itself were bending around an unseen shape. Not something visible, not something physical, but something present. I took one step back. The tone intensified. I took another. The car headlights flickered. I didn't think. I acted. I ran. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and twisted the ignition. The engine hesitated, sputtered, then roared to life. The tone rose sharply, almost like a warning or a protest, vibrating through the steering wheel. I reversed too quickly, tires grinding against the broken pavement, and swung the car back onto the curve of the road. The static followed me, not fading, not weakening, but moving with me, as though the air itself carried it along the path. Only when I reached the junction back to the main road did the sound begin to thin. Not all at once, slowly, gradually, like something receding into the depths of a long corridor. By the time lights from the outskirts of town came into view, the static was gone, but the silence it left behind was worse, because silence meant the frequency had stopped chasing me. Not that it had stopped. It meant it had learned something, and it was waiting. The drive back from Avery Ridge should have felt like relief. I had turned around. I had left the clearing with the twisted car frame and the solitary antenna behind me. The road that had hummed with static was now nothing more than a strip of broken asphalt shrinking in my rearview mirror. By any rational measure, I was moving away from the source, but nothing in my body believed that. My hands were still tight on the steering wheel when I reached the outskirts of Hickory Pass. The first houses were spaced far apart, their windows dark, as if their occupants had decided that whatever happened outside after sunset was no longer their concern. The streetlights cast pools of light that made the spaces between them feel darker, not brighter. The town looked like it had drawn its borders in light and left the rest to the ridge. I parked at the motel and sat in the car for a long time with the engine off, listening. No static, only the cooling tick of the engine, the faint hum of the motel sign, and in the distance the thin rush of a highway truck passing by somewhere beyond the tree line. Completely ordinary sounds. I clung to them, using them as a kind of anchor to pull myself out of the memory of the clearing. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I became aware of the silence between those normal sounds. The quiet intervals where, if I focused too hard, I could almost hear the afterimage of the tone from the ridge. The absence of noise felt like a space something had just vacated. The motel room smelled the same as always when I opened the door. Stale detergent, old carpet, the faint chemical note of cleaning agents trying to cover years of occupancy. Yet the familiarity didn't comfort me this time. The top drawer of the dresser waited across the room, with the same blank face. The cassette player, the tape, the towel over both of them like a hand trying to cover a wound. I didn't touch the drawer. I didn't even cross the room toward it. Instead, I went to the window and looked out at the still shapes of the cars in the lot. Mine sat among them, indistinguishable except to me. From here, there was no sign of where it had been, what it had driven into, what had pulsed through its radio without any station attached to it. It looked like any other car after dark, anonymous and parked and harmless. I slept badly again. Not because of static this time, at least not in any way I could prove. The night passed in disjointed stretches. I would close my eyes and see the antenna in the clearing, the numbers etched into its base, the way the tone had seemed to rise not from any device but from the space around it. When I drifted close to sleep, I felt the sensation of movement, the faint shift of weight, as if someone had gotten into the car beside me again and again. Each time I woke, the motel room was empty. Each time I woke, the quiet felt harder to trust. By morning, I was more exhausted than when I had lain down. The sunlight filtering through the curtains gave everything a thin, washed-out appearance, as if the day were a weaker version of itself. I showered, dressed, and set out for the archive in a mechanical sequence that relied on habit rather than intention. The car's interior felt different as soon as I sat down. It looked the same. Fabric seats, scuffed dashboard, a thin film of dust catching the light on the plastic surfaces, but there was a residual density to the air inside, like the faint echo of having been filled with sound far too loud for the space. My fingers hovered over the radio controls without touching them. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine started normally. No stalls, no misfires. The radio display lit up with the last station I had used before ever hearing the tape, a local frequency that now produced nothing but a clean, empty band. I didn't turn the volume up. I left it at 0. I pulled out of the lot and turned toward the archive. The town was marginally livelier in daylight. A delivery truck backed up to the rear entrance of a grocery store. 2 school buses collected children on opposite sides of the street. their doors folding and unfolding like slow, mechanical jaws. An older woman swept the sidewalk in front of a hardware store, her broom tracing repetitive arcs. Everything was familiar, grounded, and yet it all felt like the surface of something deeper, something that rippled just beneath the asphalt and foundations. At a stop sign near the square, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. No cars followed, no pedestrians, no cyclists. Just the intersection, the cross street, and beyond that, a small stretch of road curving toward the western edge of town. For a split second, the view in the mirror didn't match what I knew was behind me. The road in the glass looked narrower, older, the pavement cracked, the trees closer, leaning in. And just for an instant, there were 2 points of light far back in the distance, like headlights on a stretch of road that no longer existed. Then they were gone. The mirror showed only the ordinary town street again. I told myself my eyes were still tired, that my brain was projecting the memory of Avery Ridge onto any backward glance. Maybe I had blinked. Maybe a reflection had caught the glass in an odd way. There were explanations, even if they were flimsy. I turned onto the main route leading out toward the archive, determined to focus on my surroundings rather than on what lay in the rear view. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The car moved smoothly. The sky brightened. The town thinned out into clusters of houses and then into stretches of open land. The radio stayed quiet. No static leaked through the speakers. No stray tones threaded into the background. Gradually, my shoulders loosened. I reached the side street that led up to the archive building and took it without thinking. By then, the drive felt almost normal again, uneventful, forgettable. It wasn't until I pulled into the gravel lot behind the building that I realized I'd been holding my breath since leaving the motel. I cut the engine and sat there. For a moment, the car seemed to hold on to the movement it had just made, like a spinning top that hadn't quite lost all its momentum. Then the last vibrations faded and everything stilled. That was when I heard it. Not from the speakers, not from the dashboard, from underneath the car. It was subtle, just on the cusp of perception. A faint pulsing whisper, not exactly sound, but not entirely silence. I opened the door slightly, and the whisper seemed to slip out from below the chassis and into the open air, dissolving as it went. I stepped out quickly, half tempted to drop to my knees and peer under the car, but I stopped myself. I had no idea what I expected to see. There would be nothing there, just metal and dirt and shadow. And if I did hear anything, it would be nothing more than cooling components ticking. I locked the car and went inside. The archive greeted me with its familiar damp paper scent, its fluorescent light, its thin corridors lined with shelves. Yet here, too, something had shifted. Not physically. The boxes sat where they always had. The filing cabinets remained closed. The corkboard still held its ancient notices in place. But the building felt occupied, not in the sense of more people, but in the sense of something else now sharing the space. I went straight to my workspace, half expecting to find the unlabeled box moved, or the 1987 closure file disturbed. Everything sat exactly where I had left it. The only thing that looked different was the radio on the wall. The tuning dial had shifted again. It now rested closer to the strange, unlabeled band it had hovered over before, the one matching the numbers etched on the antenna at the clearing. The knob had moved another fraction of an inch, too precise and too small to blame on vibration alone. I stood there for a long moment, just staring. I had not turned the dial. No one else, as far as I knew, had been in this room since I left. The air felt denser near the radio, as it had felt near the antenna. I backed away and busied myself with the files, forcing my focus toward paper and ink. I reviewed the missing person reports again, this time paying attention not to the official language but to the timestamps. The hour of last contact, the minute the interference had surged, the moment the transmissions had cut off. What unsettled me most was not the variety of times recorded. It was the repetition of certain ones. 11:23, 12:47, 2:19. They appeared across different years, different drivers, different nights. The clock in my motel room had frozen at 12:47 before jumping. My car dashboard, on the drive back from the ridge, had shown 2:19 at one point, a detail I had only half noticed as I sped away, but now it rose in my memory with awful clarity. The road wasn't just dangerous in the usual ways. It wasn't just a place where people vanished in the physical sense. It was a place where time itself seemed to pulse. Later that day, after hours of pretending I was doing normal archival work, I left the building again. Not because I had finished anything meaningful, but because I needed to prove something to myself, that the rest of the world still followed the rules. I decided to drive beyond the town this time, not toward the ridge, but along the state highway that connected Hickory Pass to the next town over. A simple out-and-back drive, straightforward, traffic, signs, gas stations, normality in motion. The sky had begun to dull, but it was still early enough that headlights weren't necessary. The highway cut through low rolling hills, flanked by fields and occasional clusters of trees. A few vehicles shared the road with me. A pickup here, a sedan there, a distant semi-truck humming along the horizon. I kept the radio off again. I watched the rear-view mirror more than was necessary, half hoping to see nothing at all, half fearing I'd see something I couldn't explain. For the first 15 minutes, the drive was uneventful. Then just as the next town's outer signs came into view, the road ahead shimmered. Not dramatically, not like heat mirage on desert asphalt. Just a brief, subtle wavering, as if the air had shifted density in a narrow band across the highway. The steering wheel vibrated faintly in my hands. I checked the mirrors. The road behind me was no longer a simple strip of highway. For a few seconds, the perspective in the rear view changed. The pavement looked darker, rougher, like it had been laid down decades earlier and abandoned. The shoulders narrowed. The trees on either side grew taller, leaning in. And far behind me, nearly at the horizon line, there were several points of light. Headlights, multiple pairs. They appeared and disappeared in uneven intervals, like vehicles cresting unseen rises and dips. Yet on the actual highway, in front of my windshield, the traffic remained thin. No cluster of cars had passed. No vehicles trailed behind at that distance. The mirror showed one road. The windshield showed another. My pulse hammered in my throat. I blinked hard. Once, twice. The mirror stayed wrong. The longer I looked, the clearer another detail became. The lights in the rearview weren't all aligned in a single lane. Some were staggered at odd angles, as if their vehicles weren't staying within marked boundaries. Some were too high or too low for normal headlights. One pair seemed to tilt sharply sideways like a car caught mid-roll, frozen in the frame of the mirror. Then, beneath the low hum of the engine, I heard it. Static. Soft at first, almost like cloth rubbing against cloth. Then fuller, deeper, as if someone had slowly turned up the volume on an invisible channel. The radio display remained dark. No frequency shown, no power indicator. Yet the sound seeped into the cabin, not from any one direction, but from all of them at once. I gripped the wheel harder, focusing on the line of the highway ahead, trying to ignore the mirror. The static grew thicker, layered with texture. A faint rhythm emerged within it. Not quite a tone, not quite a voice, but something between. My breathing changed. It quickened. The static kept pace. Without meaning to, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. The time had frozen again. 12:47. The same time, the same numbers. Headlights in the mirror, static in the car, a frozen digital readout. The road beneath my tires hadn't changed, but the sense of movement had. I felt like I was driving through overlapping layers. Present highway, absent road, and whatever lay between. As I watched, one pair of headlights in the mirror grew larger faster than the others, as though whatever vehicle carried them was closing the distance at an unnatural speed. The angle didn't match a simple behind and approach trajectory. It felt more like something intersecting my path from another direction entirely. I didn't accelerate. I didn't brake. I couldn't do either. For a few long seconds, all I could do was drive and listen and watch. The looming headlights in the mirror shifted again, not closer now, but higher, as though the vehicle they belonged to had climbed an incline that didn't exist on the highway I physically occupied. A new texture entered the static. A low, irregular thrum, like a heavy engine not designed for these roads. The sound pressed at my eardrums, not from the speakers, but from inside the car's frame itself. Then, very faintly, beneath the static and the thrum, something else came through. Not words, not language, but a human sound. A sharp inhale, a stuttered exhalation, the kind someone makes in the moment before a crash. My chest tightened as if my own lungs were trying to match it. The mirror flashed. For a single blinding instant, every point of light in the rearview flared at once, as if all the vehicles that had ever vanished on that erased road had aligned their final moments into a single shared reflection. And then, it was over. The static cut off. The sound vanished. The mirror showed only the thin, open highway behind me once more. Pale gray, mildly cracked, empty. The time on the dashboard jumped. 1:03. I had lost 16 minutes in a stretch of distance that felt much shorter than the numbers implied. I drove the rest of the way to the next town in a numb autopilot. I parked in a grocery store lot, sat there with the engine off, and stared at the traffic moving past. People came and went between their cars and the entrance, carrying bags, talking on phones, adjusting their coats. No one flinched or looked up. No one acted as if anything had just rippled beneath the surface of the road connecting their town to mine. The highway looked clean, but I knew better now. The road wasn't empty. It was crowded with echoes. Somewhere between Hickory Pass and the ridge, between the motel clock and the archive radio, between the erased map lines and the etched numbers on the antenna, something had built a corridor. A place where time folded and layered and replayed the last moments of those who had vanished. I thought of the cassette waiting in the motel drawer, of the sheriff who had warned me without saying what he'd seen, of the way the townspeople refused to look toward the western ridge as if not seeing it would keep them safe. I understood something then that I hadn't fully grasped before. Avery Ridge Road wasn't just a location, it was a channel. And now, whatever traveled along it had found others. The roads around Hickory Pass, the motel, the archive, my car, they were all connected now. Not by asphalt and gravel and paint, but by a frequency that had learned how to move. And I was no longer just passing through it. I was part of the pattern. I drove back to Hickory Pass just before dusk, though I don't remember deciding to go. My body followed the route mechanically, guided by muscle memory rather than intention. The sun was low, caught in the tree line, and the sky held that flattened yellow-gray hue that appears just before full darkness. Not quite evening, not quite day. The kind of light that reveals nothing clearly. By the time I reached the motel parking lot, my shoulders ached from how tightly I'd gripped the steering wheel. My mind felt fogged, like thick static had settled into the folds of my thoughts and refused to lift. I sat in the car after turning off the engine, hands resting on my lap, feeling the faint tremor in them. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself the drive had been long and strange, and the mirror incident could be explained by reflection, by trick light, by a tired mind reaching for patterns. But my breathing said otherwise. My breathing was shallow, controlled, the kind a body uses when it expects something to appear in the periphery. Eventually, I forced myself inside. The motel room was exactly as I had left it, the curtains drawn halfway, the bedspread slightly wrinkled, the towel still covering the top drawer. No disturbance, no shifted objects, no humming electronics, nothing out of place. That emptiness should have comforted me. It didn't. My eyes kept drifting toward the drawer, the cassette player, the tape, the recording that responded to radios, clocks, engines, air. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let the silence fill the room. The heater made an occasional metallic tick, but no static threaded through the walls this time. It struck me that I hadn't heard the town itself breathe since returning. No voices outside, no cars, no footsteps. As though the world had thinned somehow, like a broadcast losing strength. I opened the drawer. The towel shifted with a soft whisper, revealing the cassette player beneath it. The device looked darker than when I had last seen it, though I knew that was impossible. Plastic doesn't darken overnight, but its presence had a weight that hadn't been there before. The cassette sat exactly where I'd placed it. Date, 10/14/87. No label, no identifying marks aside from the faded ink. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to summon restraint. I knew that listening to it here alone was reckless, irrational, but I also knew something else. The road, the ridge, the static, the mirror, the tones. Everything was converging. Avoiding the tape wouldn't save me from whatever had started following me. It would only delay it. I lifted the cassette and slid it into the player. The click when it locked in place felt too loud in the quiet room, as though the sound had more weight than plastic on metal should. My thumb hovered over the play button for a long time, long enough that the air felt thicker, as if waiting for me to complete a circuit. I pressed play. The hiss came first. Soft, slow, rhythmic. Not the harsh, jagged audio degradation that old tapes usually produce, but a measured, steady release of air through unseen cracks. The same breathing quality I had heard the first time I listened to it, but now it felt stronger, as though the recording had somehow grown fuller, more present. Then the static rose through the hiss. I tensed instinctively. It came in evenly spaced pulses like a heart monitor played through dust. A swell, a withdrawal, a narrow thread of silence. Then another swell, as though the static itself was responding to my heartbeat, or maybe it was the other way around. The tone followed. A low, singular note, familiar yet changed. The version on the ridge had been crisp and resonant. In the motel, it sounded closer, like it was being produced inside the room rather than within the tape. It repeated, paused, repeated again, and under it, faint but unmistakable, was something new. A sound that should not have been there. Not static, not tone, not wind or voice. A click, soft, sharp, perfectly spaced. I had heard the exact pattern before, in the archive, when the old wall-mounted radio had vibrated. A mechanical twitch like an aging device trying not to function. But here, the clicks were not coming from an external object trying to tune itself. They were recorded, captured, preserved. Someone, in 1987, had been near something emitting that precise sound. My pulse escalated. The air in the room seemed to contract. The heater stopped clicking entirely, as if the building itself was listening. The static thickened, layering itself into something complex, almost textured. It was no longer simply noise. It carried structure, cadence, repetition, patterns. Patterns like the ones handwritten in the margins of the reports. Patterns consistent. I leaned forward slightly, trying to isolate one thread from the others. That's when I heard it. A human sound. Faint, muffled, buried beneath the static. Not a word. Not a scream. Not breathing. A whisper of motion. Fabric shifting, gravel underfoot. Something brushing the microphone. The kind of sound produced by someone adjusting the recorder. Someone turning towards something they did not understand. My chest tightened. A burst of distortion surged through the speakers, brief, violent like proximity feedback. The lights in the motel room dimmed, flickered, then steadied. The tone deepened until I felt it in my sternum. I reached instinctively for the stop button. Before I could press it, the recording changed. The static collapsed inward, pulling itself into a single narrow band of sound, thin, metallic, almost melodic. Beneath it came a faint mechanical oscillation, rising and falling in slow intervals. And then, under that, barely audible, something else emerged. A voice-like shape. Not language, not articulation. Just the shape of a voice. The rhythm, the cadence, the rising of syllables without forming anything that could be translated. An imprint of something trying to communicate without possessing the tools. And then it shifted. For a moment, a fleeting, awful moment, the shape of the sound matched the sound of my own breath. The same length of inhale. The same tremor in the exhale. The same pattern. It was echoing me, or learning me. I hit stop. The silence that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt like interruption, like I had cut off something mid-sentence. I sat very still, waiting for my heart to slow. It didn't. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the silence darker. My breath was too loud, too present, and I felt suddenly exposed. Like my breathing was now a recognizable pattern, something outside myself could follow. I glanced at the cassette player. The tape inside had stopped spinning, yet I could still feel a faint vibration through the desk. For a sickening moment, I thought the tape was continuing to play despite having been stopped, but the vibration was too slow, too steady. It matched the intervals of the tone. I pulled the cassette from the player. Its plastic felt warm, not ambient warm. Body warm, like it had been held. I set it carefully on the desk and stepped back. My breath came too quickly now and the room felt distorted, as if my depth perception had shifted. The air hummed faintly, not from electrical sources but from something else entirely. The residual presence of a frequency that did not belong in this world. I realized then that the recording I had just listened to was not the original. It couldn't be. Magnetic tape degrades. Frequencies distort. Soundscapes lose their fidelity. But what I heard had not degraded. It had evolved, changed, adapted. A recording from 1987 should not feel aware, but this one did. I forced myself to sit, forced myself to breathe deliberately, even though each breath felt like something was watching it. I reached for the files I had brought from the archive, not because I intended to work, but because I needed to anchor myself to something familiar. Paper, ink, human handwriting. The the world of documents instead of signals. I flipped to the pages with the marginal notes. Patterns consistent, not atmospheric. Same location, and the erased words still visible if I tilted the page toward the lamp. Listening. I looked back at the cassette. It sat motionless, but I knew, with the same certainty I knew my own reflection, that the tape was not inert. It was not passive. It was not archival in the traditional sense. It was a receiver. And I had just opened its channel. I placed the files aside and pressed the heel of my hand to my forehead. My mind felt stretched thin, as if holding two realities at once: the physical world of motel rooms and highways, and the unseen architecture of the frequency that threaded through all of it. I didn't know what the recording wanted, but I now knew something far worse. It wasn't only playing back sound, it was waiting, for what I couldn't imagine, for whom I didn't want to guess. But the tape was not a relic. It was part of an active system, one that had no reason to stop now that I had accessed it again. It wasn't the recording that shouldn't exist. It was the listener, me. I didn't leave Hickory Pass the next morning. I should have. By any sane measure, that was the moment to run, to pack my bag, return the room key, put miles and radio towers and topography between myself and the ridge. I had enough material to justify an early exit. I could have blamed the infrastructure, the state of the archive, the strain of working alone in a building that felt more like a sealed chamber than a place of record. Instead, I stayed. Not because I wanted to, not because I was brave. I stayed because I understood something that made leaving feel less like escape and more like a delayed inevitability. The road wasn't the only entry point anymore. Whatever had started on Avery Ridge had already followed me into the motel, the archive, the clock, the car. It had threaded itself into the devices and the empty spaces between them. Leaving didn't mean cutting contact. It meant taking the connection with me. So I stayed one more day, telling myself that as long as I remained where it had started, where the pattern was centered, I could at least see it clearly. Maybe understand it. Maybe decide how to live with it. The morning light was weak when it came through the curtains, filtered through a low, colorless cloud cover. The motel room seemed smaller than the night before, as if the walls had pulled in while I slept. For a moment after waking, I didn't remember where I was. Then the weight in my chest returned and my eyes went straight to the desk. The cassette sat where I left it. The player sat beside it, its buttons still in the neutral position. There was no sound, no vibration, no reason for my pulse to spike the way it did. But it did anyway. I didn't touch the tape. I got dressed, gathered the files I needed to return to the archive, and left the room without turning on the television, the radio, or even the bathroom fan. Anything that plugged in felt like a potential doorway. Outside, the town was caught in a kind of muted motion. Cars moved, people crossed streets. A dog barked once in the distance. But everything felt slightly slowed, as though time had been stretched without anyone noticing. The sky held that same low, swollen look, smearing the light across the landscape instead of letting it fall cleanly. I drove to the archive with the radio off, not just at 0 volume this time, fully off, power disconnected. It didn't matter. The silence still hummed in a way that felt like an afterimage of static. The building appeared almost normal when I arrived. The same rusted frames around the windows, the same aging concrete steps, the same dull, unwelcoming facade. Yet as I approached the door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a faint line of rust on the outer wall, just beneath one of the narrow windows. It ran vertically, thin and straight, like dried residue from a leak. At its base, near the ground, the line widened into a small, irregular patch. The shape looked disturbingly like an old antenna mount point. Metal removed, base left behind. Something about the pattern of that rust told me this building had once held more than a wall-mounted radio. Maybe not a tower, maybe not anything obvious from the road, but some kind of relay, something designed to catch and transmit. I filed that detail away, because acknowledging it too fully meant accepting a larger, uglier possibility, that the archive itself had not been chosen for my work by accident. Inside, the air had cooled overnight, but the scent of damp paper and insulation was stronger. It reminded me of the tape's hiss, the same wet dryness, the same layered quality. The fluorescent lights flickered once before settling, their tone slightly lower than before, as if the electricity humming through them had thickened. My workspace was exactly as I had left it. The box, the files, the radio on the wall. The tuning dial had moved, not just a fraction this time. It sat directly over the blank band. No numbers, no station call signs, no designation. The physical presence of the needle over an absence felt wrong in a way I couldn't language. It was like watching a compass needle settle toward a direction that no map acknowledged. I didn't touch it. I sat, opened the 1987 file again, and went through the motions of work. It was a performance, turning pages, tracing dates, aligning documents, adding small notes to my own notebook. But my attention kept slipping back to the radio, the antenna at the ridge, and the tape in the motel room that felt less like recording and more like conduit. The sheriff's words replayed in my mind. People who stayed longer had trouble leaving. Not everyone vanished physically. Some, I realized now, might have left on paper, on maps, in the formal sense, but remained here in another way, their last sounds absorbing into the frequency, layered and replayed. I made it until midday. I lasted that long before the building itself pushed everything to a point I could no longer ignore. It began subtly, with a change in the background hum. At first, I thought it was another truck passing on the road outside, maybe a heavier vehicle with a lower engine tone. But the sound didn't move. It didn't approach or recede. It simply grew, slowly, as though someone were turning up the volume on the structure itself. The radio remained dark. No indicator light, no glow. The sound got deeper. I stood up, pulse thudding, and stepped out into the hallway. The hum was there too, in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Not loud enough to rattle anything, but present enough that I felt it in my teeth. I walked toward the main room where the older shelves and map cases were kept. The air there was colder, and I could feel the hum more distinctly. It had rhythm now, not a steady beat, not something that belonged to any machine I recognized, but recurring, rising, falling, a long, slow interval between peaks, almost like breath. I returned to my workspace and looked over at the radio. The casing vibrated, not dramatically, not visibly from a distance, but when I stepped closer, I could see a faint quiver along the edge where metal met wall. Everything I had felt in the motel, everything I had heard in the car, everything I had experienced on the ridge, it all threaded together in that vibration. The tape, the antenna, the frozen clocks, the headlights in the mirror. Different manifestations of the same presence, the same system. I realized then, with the clarity that terror sometimes brings, that the recording in my motel room wasn't just receiving the signal. It was part of a feedback loop. The more I listened, the more it learned. The more it learned, the more it could manifest. The more it manifested, the more access points it found. The ridge wasn't merely a place where it existed. It was where it had been strongest, where it had been first. But the pattern was no longer confined there. It was spreading along connective tissue, power lines, radios, old infrastructure, even the gaps in signal where devices strained to find channels that weren't there. And I was the constant. The common denominator, the person who had moved from room to room, building to building, road to road, with the frequency in tow. I understood then why people tried to erase the road, why maps were altered, why notices were torn down, why the sheriff spoke around it instead of about it. They weren't trying to hide a place. They were trying to starve a channel, to reduce the points of contact, to let the system decay from lack of listeners. And I had opened it again. I stood there, facing the wall-mounted radio, not touching it, not daring to test the dial. The hum in the room deepened one last time, swelling into a low, almost subsonic wave that pressed against my sternum. Then, abruptly, it cut off, not faded, stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The fluorescent lights buzzed normally. The thermostat ticked. Distant footsteps echoed somewhere deeper in the building. Everything was as it had been, except me. I knew in that stillness that I could no longer trust the difference between silence and transmission. The system didn't need constant noise. It didn't need to announce itself. It could wait. It had patience measured not in hours or days, but in years, decades. I closed the 1987 file. I placed every document neatly back into the unlabeled box. I put the box back into the cabinet under the desk. I didn't label it. I didn't mark it in the ledger. I let it resume the state in which I'd found it, a box without a name. I left the radio as it was, its dial still pointing at the blank band. If I turned it away, I felt as if I would be accepting ownership of something I didn't want. If I unplugged it, I felt as if I'd be daring it to find another path. I walked out of the archive without checking in with anyone. The air outside felt thinner but no less charged. The clouds had descended lower, blending with the tops of the trees. The ridge was hidden. I went back to the motel. The room was too quiet. The tape lay on the desk where I had left it that morning, beside the notebook with my scattered chronology of events. For a long moment, I simply stared at it, feeling something close to the impulse a person feels when standing at a high ledge, the urge to look down longer than is safe. I understood something else now. The recording didn't just contain traces of the unknown source. It contained traces of those who had heard it, drivers on the ridge, dispatchers on the other end of the last calls, anyone who had listened long enough to be patterned. I wondered how much of me was on it already. I couldn't erase the tape. I considered it briefly, imagining the reels ripped out, the plastic snapped, the magnetic strip torn and thrown into separate bins. But the thought of destroying it filled me with a strangely visceral dread. Not fear of losing evidence, fear of what might be unleashed if the loop was broken incomplete. It felt less like an object that needed to be destroyed, and more like something that needed to be contained. Not in a specialized lab, not under observation, just out of circulation, away from curious hands, far from receivers. I made my choice then. Not the choice of a hero or a martyr, but the choice of someone who had realized they had stumbled into the path of something vast and didn't want anyone else to follow. I took an empty envelope from my bag. I placed the cassette inside. I slid my notes in with it. A short summary of what I'd discovered, recorded in clinical language that didn't begin to capture the full shape of the experience. Dates, locations, anomalies. The existence of a closed road whose official record didn't match its reality. Mentions of synchronized times, repeating frequencies, and unexplained interference. I didn't include the personal parts. The breathing that matched mine. The frozen numbers on the motel clock, the headlights in the mirror. Those were the pieces that made it real. Those were the pieces that would make someone like me want to listen. I addressed the envelope not to an agency, not to the sheriff, not to any town authority. I addressed it to a storage facility tied to a larger regional archive in another state, under an innocuous project title, and an even more innocuous description. Unprocessed 1980s audio, roadside infrastructure survey. It would be stored. It would be cataloged. It would sink eventually beneath layers of more urgent work. It would become one more forgotten artifact among thousands. Still dangerous but insulated by obscurity. I left it at the small post office on the edge of town, paid for ground shipment, and did not ask for tracking. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faintest trace of something metallic. Not static, not quite, but close. I went back to the motel one last time. I packed. Clothes, notebook, remaining files that were mine and not part of any official archive. I avoided looking at the television, the clock, the power outlets. Everything felt like an ear. At the front desk, I turned in the key without explanation. The clerk didn't ask why I was leaving early. Their eyes didn't quite meet mine. It occurred to me that in a town like Hickory Pass, early departures were probably expected. People who realized, too late, that they had brushed against something they couldn't name. The drive out of town was quiet. The sky remained low. The ridge remained invisible behind the clouds. I didn't take the road toward it. I took the opposite one, the route that would eventually intersect with a larger highway, and then with another and another, until Hickory Pass became a name on a sign instead of a place I could feel. For the first half hour, nothing unusual happened. No static, no mirages in the rear view, no frozen time. Gradually, my grip on the wheel loosened. I allowed myself to believe that putting distance between myself and the ridge mattered. That whatever had layered itself into the infrastructure of that town would thin out beyond its perimeter. It was only when I stopped for gas at a station miles away, in a town whose name I can barely remember now, that I understood the part of this I had been refusing to acknowledge. While I waited for the tank to fill, I went inside to buy a bottle of water. The station had a small convenience store attached, fluorescent lights buzzing, shelves stacked with snacks, a radio playing low near the cashier. A perfectly normal scene. I paid, thanked them, and turned toward the door. The radio behind me changed. The song cut off mid-note. Static replaced it. Not ordinary, broadcast static. Not the soft, unfocused white noise of a station between stations. Layered static, structured static, the kind that breathes, the kind that learns. I paused with my hand on the door. Behind me, the cashier muttered something under their breath. Probably about the signal dropping, probably about the old wiring. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Because beneath that static, through the mild hum of refrigerators and the rustle of plastic and the distant hiss of cars at the pumps, I heard something else. A low, singular tone. Slow, measured, familiar. I stepped outside. The air felt no different from any other roadside town, yet my chest tightened. The pump clicked as it finished. My car waited by the curb like any other car. The sky above was clearer here, the cloud cover thinner. Everything looked harmless. But that didn't matter anymore. The system wasn't local. The pattern wasn't bounded by geography alone. The ridge had been an origin point, maybe the strongest, maybe the first. But the frequency had learned new routes. It traveled where there were receivers, radios, clocks, power grids, any device that strained to catch signal. It traveled where there were people willing to listen, people like me. I realized then that going back to Hickory Pass would be meaningless. The town, the archive, the road, the clearing, they were still dangerous, still heavy with connection. But they were no longer the only places that mattered. I didn't need to return to stand on the ridge to be part of the system. I already was. I got back into the car. I turned the key. The engine started immediately. The radio display remained dark. I didn't touch it. I pulled onto the highway and merged with the flow of traffic, one vehicle among many. Sunlight broke through a gap in the clouds ahead, spilling across a stretch of road that looked as ordinary as any. I drove forward. I don't know how long it will take before I hear the tone again. In another motel room, on another drive at night, in a store, a lobby, a waiting room, somewhere in the innocuous spaces where radios hum and clocks sit, and no one expects the air itself to listen. I can never go back to Hickory Pass, not because the town is the only haunted place, but because now I understand what it means to cross a boundary that wasn't meant for us. Once you tune into something that shouldn't exist, you don't untune. You just learn to live, knowing that somewhere, on a frequency no one mapped, something is still there. Still transmitting. Still listening. Waiting for someone like me to hear it again.